Hey guys, today I'll be showing you how I made this fake live edge black epoxy river table inspired entirely by BlackTail Studios. I decided to try my hands at an epoxy river table, and we needed an end table for the living room because the end table we had was very small and we had everyone's cords plugged in charging their phones and there was not enough space, so I wanted the maximum space for the epoxy river table that I could for an end table. Hello, my name is Mark Jones. I don't know if you have seen any of my other videos. I build a guitar. I also have a long video where I build this table. This is just going to go more into depth of my black walnut epoxy river table here. This was my first go at an epoxy river table. I had a lot of fun with it, and thanks for checking out this video to see my journey with my first epoxy project. So now that I cut that with no fence and no miter gauge, which I do not recommend, I wanted to get the maximum width that I could for this epoxy river table. So there was a lot of dust coming up. I noticed I hadn't turned on my vacuum, and for some reason with the blade still going, I left my saw on and walked away from my lumber, which I also do not recommend. But anyways, I wanted the maximum size table that I could get. Here I am building my form. I'm going to cut the edges for my form, and I don't like the way that I built the form. I wish I used pocket hole screws, but as you can see here in a second, I cut the edges of the form too small, and here I am ripping them for the sides. I cut them too small for the way I did it. I ended up screwing it from the side into the bottom of the MDF base. Now what I should have done was I should have cut the base bigger and used pocket hole screws to screw these down. I only gave myself like a 1/4 inch gap to have as a buffer for the epoxy that I pour, which you'll see later in the video. I would recommend having at least an inch of clearance rather than a 1/4 inch. My top is slightly bigger than 3/4 inch material, and I only cut this to about 1 3/4 inch strips for the edges of my form, giving me literally only like a 1/4 inch gap for any overspray or overfill. Now I use this Tyvek tape because it will not stick to the epoxy. Now this Tyvek tape was very difficult to find in Home Depot. It was literally in the last aisle back corner on the bottom underneath other stuff on the shelf for the house wrapping tape. It was difficult to find. I'll put a link down in this description. Here's a first preview of the top before I put the epoxy. The piece that cracked there, I'm just going to end up using it anyways. It's going to turn out great. And I left an edge purposefully on this because I want to fill epoxy inside there to kind of keep the appearance of a fake live edge. See how there's plenty of room for epoxy to be filled in there. I thought it would look really cool, and I was all excited for it. So now here's the epoxy that I use. This is just a first coat to stabilize the wood so that there would be something to adhere to, and I wouldn't be wasting a bunch of epoxy that I later colored because my math was off. I put epoxy inside the crack and any imperfections that I'm going to fill with epoxy later, and I put shellac on any flat surfaces so that I would not dye the wood. You have to scuff up any previous epoxy you do if you do multiple pours, otherwise the other layer of epoxy will not adhere to the first layer of epoxy that you put. Here's the epoxy I'm using. It's a deep pour epoxy. I need 64 ounces, so I end up going for 32 and 32. My black pigments is just going to be some acrylic paint because my pigments wouldn't come in. When you're pouring this, you want to get eye level so that you are as accurate as possible when you're pouring this mixture.
How much is this shit?
What?
All this shit.
This was $87.
Holy shit.
For 40 something.
Oh.
You got it for like 47, like 40% off. Now, as you heard, I got a really good deal on this epoxy, which is the reason why I wanted to go for it. We had a need at an end table, and I wanted to experiment with epoxy. So I saw I had it at about half price, and I thought, hey, let's give this a go, because why not? I originally wanted to put a floating shelf where this table would go, but because I got the deal on epoxy, I was like, hey, let's give this a try. So now everybody's favorite part is the mixing, and I had a very difficult time with it. I used my drill, and the drill was too powerful. I ended up turning it down, and even when I turned it down, it was so powerful that I ended up needing 4 hands. If I was a primate, this would be 4 hands, but I used my feet, worked just fine. After mixing that for 6 minutes, they want you to wait for 6 minutes, and then if you can, pop the bubbles. Now, the bubble popping is obviously very satisfying. You can tell from every video of epoxy tables you've ever seen that you enjoyed it. Now, the pour is another favorite part that everyone has, and as you can see, I almost dumped half of that first pour onto my dinner table, but thankfully I didn't. I caught it just in time. This didn't come out of the bucket as easy as you think it would. Maybe invest in a better bucket, I don't know. See, there again, very difficult to estimate where it comes out. Up, look, all over the place, which is fine because I'm going to later use a credit card to scrape everything into those corners like I was showing you previously earlier in the video. Estimating how much epoxy I needed was very difficult for the first time that I did this. I've since made an epoxy table, or at least an epoxy project, and it worked out much better, but it doesn't matter. I ended up first time for everything, learn from your mistakes. I had 1 bubble. That's all the mistake that I had during this. I thought that was pretty successful. Alright, I'm a bad video guy, I'm sorry. So I took it out of the form and I planed it down. Let's see if I can get it good here, probably just here. I just used a hand plane because it didn't fit through my surface planer. And for instance, right here, it's a lot lower than here. And this will all be this color when it's said and done. But that was that bubble area. Let's see, I get up close to it. So that's low. And then a couple low spots here and a crack or two that I'm going to, I set up a dam just with Tyvek tape to fill this in. I nicked it with the surface planer, or with the hand plane. Got a little snipe there. Ugly right there. And it's the width of the 3-inch plane or whatever. So I'm just going to fill it with clear epoxy. And then it goes down deep a little bit here. I'm going to fill it with clear epoxy, and then once I router the edge, you won't be able to tell on the black epoxy. You will be able to tell on the wood, but it's just something we're going to have to live with. But yeah, and then like over here, it's a little low, but it's not low enough to put whatever up. I'm going to cut all of these sides still to true it up. But yeah, like right here, I'm going to end up sanding it. It's so low that it doesn't really matter. Sorry that I didn't have a shot of me planing it, but a little touch up. And I'm going to sand this so the epoxy adheres better to the little areas. Alright, after sanding now, I mixed up a small batch of epoxy. This is that first epoxy I used just to fill any cracks and grooves and the couple low spots. See how I'm just kind of pouring it in there and trying to push it down a little to get into the crack. Here's that big sniped area that I'm dumping on. So now what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to sand. This is me sanding the bottom. I'm sanding the epoxy. I was trying to flatten this as much as possible. And if you can tell, it's harder. The epoxy is harder to sand than the wood. Now, what does that mean? The actual hardness of the epoxy takes longer to sand than the softness of the wood. I end up sanding the bottom of this all the way to 220. What you want to do is you want to put your sander on the surface and then turn it on. Otherwise, you're going to have deep gouging swirl marks in the tabletop. So I ended up filling this with a grain filler, and it wasn't a clear grain filler, so I got very upset. Don't do that. I finished it with shellac just as a cover so that the wood would not warp in between days. Now what I do here is I end up sanding this completely flat. Again, I sanded all the way up to 180, which was recommended for the Rubio Monocoat that I'm going to use. But before that, before my final sand, see how there's a couple of little imperfections and cracks that didn't completely get filled. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to clean it with mineral spirits once first. I ended up drenching this with mineral spirits. I wanted to make sure I got all the dust up, and if you see on the cloth, you can tell it is really dusty. There is the snipe right there. It ends up, it's not too bad. You can tell it's there, but once I routed the profile, it's not too bad. So with these little dots left, I'm going to fill it with CA glue, and there's the activator. Little dot of glue, come back with the activator, and boom! There, dry instantly. Alright, after I finish sand that, I'm going to hit it with mineral spirits one more time before I go for my final coat of finish that's coming up next. I wanted to make sure I took my time with this one, made sure I got every piece of dust. I think I ended up coming back with a tack cloth also. So anyways, on the bottom here, after I tri-fold my piece of paper towel that I'm using as an applicator, for some reason I dunk it straight into the container of shellac, which later is going to contaminate the entire thing of shellac. But I mainly use shellac just for sealer coat in between projects, so I wasn't too worried about this. I do use this as my final coat for the bottom of the tabletop. Now what I'm doing here is I'm taking my time, going stroke by stroke, covering all bases. The first coat I put on pretty thick. I think I only did 2 coats, but you could see how the epoxy that's kind of hazed over darkens up, clears up real smooth and easy when you put finish on it. Now, what you want to do when you're sanding the epoxy for a final sand, you just want to make sure everything is uniform and there are no pigtails, little curly pigtails left in the epoxy, because those will show up really easy in the epoxy. But if you take your time, just, you got to spend a little more time on the epoxy than the wood itself. It ends up looking really good. A thin coat of shellac will dry in about 15 minutes, but if you want it to dry a little quicker so you can get more coats on, you can thin it down with denatured alcohol. Actually, I oftentimes do that with my first coat. I get a really thin coat mixture of shellac, so I can really just slosh it around, sand it, and then get 2 thicker coats afterwards. I usually do 3 coats. Actually, I'm not liking the way I am applying this shellac, watching this back. Looking at it, wish I took more time with it. Alright, here we go for the fun part. At least this is the part that has got Instagram going crazy over Rubio Monocoat. 2-part activator, hardener, and the Pure itself. Pure is just going to enhance the color of the wood, so it's a 3-to-1 ratio. You end up mixing it up for really just a minute. You put it on the wood and then just spread it with a Bondo scraper. You could do it with a plastic putty knife also, or a credit card. It really doesn't matter. Credit card, or like a a gift card. I tried going, this was the first time I used this, so I tried digging it into the wood itself. Now, the good thing about Rubio Monocoat is it sticks only to the wood fibers of the wood, and the sides were tricky, so I ended up coming back with a paper towel and finishing the sides with that. Now, it's only going to stick to the wood fibers, and that's why it's a simple, easy one-step finish. Really one-step finish. So what you're going to do is, after you spread it with the Bondo, you're going to want to try to buff it in here with just a cloth, and later I come back with a buffer pad on my orbital sander to really dig into the fibers. Now, I think I did 2 coats because I'd never done this before, and I didn't really think the look of it was what I was going for, but I honestly, after doing the second coat, I know that I did not have to do a second coat. The one coat would have been fine. And honestly, it's been a year since I've made this, since I've had the table, and I have had zero problems whatsoever with this tabletop finish. Rubio Monocoat's usually a floor finish that has become really popular in the furniture industry. Now here I am with that buffing wheel that I said I had. Once again, you see how I put the sander on the table before I turned it on. Now with this super soft buffing wheel, you shouldn't have needed it, but it's just best practice to do the same thing over and over again. Now I did make sure that I blew my sander out before this. It's an old sander that there's sand particles that have stuck to the sander, as you can see there, but I blew it off with compressed air and it wasn't coming off, so I was confident that no dust would be stuck in the finish of this Rubio Monocoat tabletop. Now again, I said I finished the bottom of this with shellac, and then I did only the top of the table with Rubio Monocoat. This is the first time that I used Rubio for a tabletop finish. I was very excited. In hindsight, I probably would have done both sides with Rubio, but it was my first time, and I knew after 24 hours you could touch Rubio, you could use it, but it takes really a week to cure, so I didn't want to wait that time. I wanted to be able to put it down. In hindsight, it would have been fine because it's just the bottom of the table, but I thought this was best practice at the time. Now, sorry about the camera angle because the sun's blaring you guys in the face. I did this after work one day, and actually it's kind of a cinematic effect, but sorry if you're looking away from the screen because the sun was blaring you. I want to say thanks for watching. If you have any thoughts, concerns, ideas, something I could have done better, please leave it in the comments. I'd ask you to subscribe to watch the journey, but you do not necessarily have to like this video. Here's me just finishing putting the top on. I have the full table build in another video that I'll link in the description below. And here is my fake live edge black epoxy walnut end table. Thanks for watching.